The one that I get really most upset about is people who say they're going to do a salivary cortisol estimation on you. I mean, you can't do it. It's completely meaningless.
So, Professor Lightman, thank you so much for joining me today. I think probably the easiest place to start is if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, where you work, what your kind of background and key interests are. Would that be possible?
Yes, of course. My name's Stafford Lightman. I'm Professor of Medicine at the University of Bristol. My specialty is neuroendocrinology, and that basically means the study of hormones, the way hormones affect the brain, and the way the brain affects hormones. My background, well, originally I did anthropology and I've done anthropological fieldwork in various interesting parts of the world, like Central Mato Grosso and Brazil and New Guinea. But after that, I was always interested in behavior, and I came into medicine to study aspects of behavior, and particularly the way hormones affect.
Fantastic. And that's obviously why we're here today. So let's start with something simple. So a little bit of the science, if you're okay with that. When we talk about stress, and I guess we'll start with acute stress in the first instance, what does that mean? And is that a good term?
I think that's a very important question because the term stress is used incredibly loosely by different people. And in fact, when different people use it, it means completely different things to those individuals. I prefer not to use the word stress if I possibly can. And what I like to use is the term stressor. That is something that causes a stress. And so if you have stressors, they will cause your body to be stressed in various ways. And this might be an acute stressor, as an event, a specific event that occurs, or there might be chronic stressors which occur over a prolonged period of time. And so if we think in terms like that, it's easier to understand what we mean by stress.
No, that's very helpful. And I think we'll unpack it even more as we talk about. I think just to start with, just for the benefit of myself and the listeners, there are two key differences. There are the acute stresses of life, and then there are potentially those more chronic stressors. But let's start with acute stress, if you okay. We're all kind of familiar with the fight or flight response. Um, but do you mind just giving us a little bit of background about what stress is from a kind of biological point of view? What is actually happening, and is it a good or a bad thing?
I think the really important thing to understand about acute stress is that it is adaptive. It is an extremely useful response to some threat. So when we're talking about stress, I think the important thing to bear in mind is that we're talking about perceived stress. So uh, nothing necessarily needs to have happened to you. But if you're perceiving a situation as stressful, that is sufficient for it to act as a stressor upon your system. So, you know, if you think something terrible is going to happen to you, you will have a stress response before you go to an interview. Nothing's happened to you, but you will feel stressed because you perceive that the situation you're in is going to be stressful. Now, the acute stress response is really important because, I mean, if you imagine that you're walking across the savannah and a lion appears, you don't want to be just totally laid back and say, oh, there's a lion. You want to do everything you possibly can to get away from that lion. And so you have an acute response which does several things. You have a hormonal response, which helps you put up your blood sugar. You have a cardiac response, which puts up your heart rate, which means that there's more blood and more sugar going around in the body. And you also have an activational process in the brain, which is really very interesting because what it does is it makes you ignore all the things that you might be thinking about. You've got an itch in your big toe or something like this. You ignore all of that. Then the only thing that happens is your brain concentrates on, let's say, the tree that's 50 yards away, which is your only way to escape. And it actually changes your mental processes. So acute stress is adaptive. It is something that is very useful, and without it, you could imagine that in an environment like the African plains, you would be eaten very soon because you wouldn't be adapting to what's going on around you.
Are there any developments in that area of research? Any kind of key headlines that you would say in the last 10 years that perhaps we understand the biology a bit more, perhaps we're able to test it differently, or anything within that kind of acute stress response kind of pathway that's novel or new that we may not know about?
Well, okay, let's say what we do know about is that you get a response to catecholamines, that's adrenaline and noradrenaline, extremely quickly. And then soon after that, you get a response of a stress hormone, cortisol. And these are things that we have known for a long time are important in your metabolic and your cardiovascular response to a stress. What we have learned much more about in the last decade or so is that uh, during stress, there are lots of changes in the pathways in the brain and the way the brain functions, and which circuits in the brain, which groups of brain cells are talking to each other at that time to help you respond to the particular stress that is going on. So we understand much better now what's going on in the brain. Not perfectly, but we do understand it much better. And when you think about it, your perception of stress is all in the brain. You're not perceiving it. Your adrenal glands don't perceive stress. It's only the brain that receives it. So the whole of the regulatory system around this acute stress is in the brain, and that we are beginning to understand the circuits involved in that now.
What would happen if somebody, sticking with the acute stresses, say someone who experiences acute stressful life events quite infrequently versus someone who was just, for whatever situation, was experiencing more frequent amounts of acute stressful events? What does that do? Presumably, like you mentioned, there is an adaptive response, things are changing the brain. Is that person becoming more heightened and aware? Or are they becoming more resilient? Or is it, like all things, far too complex?
Well, it's not too complex, but it is complex. So acute stress, as I said, is adaptive. Chronic stress or stressors uh, over a long period of time, getting divorced, losing your house, losing your job, all these things like this, which are very protracted, those are maladaptive because basically, if you think about it, the sort of things that happen in response to acute stress are very good for a short period of time. But if you can keep doing this, so you're keeping your blood pressure up, you're keeping your blood sugar up, all of these things are happening over a prolonged period of time, then the whole system starts to begin to fail and things go wrong. And this is happening in the brain as well. There's when the circuits that change when you go into acute stress, you keep activating those circuits, they get rather more fixed. And then at a time when you should just be doing normal things in your normal life, these stress circuits in your brain are still going on, and these will make it more likely for you to get depressed, anxious, and various other conditions like that. So chronic stress is maladaptive, and that's what the problem is when we talk about stress-related disease.
So what might be some of the physical impacts? Like what at an organ level, does that make sense?
It does, but I'd like to go back a step because humans are all extremely different, and the way we respond to chronic stressors is very different. First of all, we have very different genes, and our genetic background will alter the way we respond to stress. But probably even more important is early life events. So if you've had an extremely uh, difficult childhood with maybe abusive parents or things like this going on, or you've been assaulted as a child, these are going to change the way you respond to a stress when you're an adult. So then you're putting an adult under chronic stress for whatever reason. And you will have some people who are brought up in a really good, have good genes, are brought up in a really good environment, and they will be pretty resilient. And almost whatever you do with them, they'll probably be all right. But then you have somebody whose parents have been in jail and they've had a terrible upbringing, and you put these people under chronic stress, and they will have all sorts of nasty, unpleasant medical responses to having had it. So I think we need to be really careful not to say chronic stress gives you this or gives you that. it makes you more susceptible. And the problem, of course, with this is that there's no good science or no statistics because we could look in a rat and we could have lots of identical rats that have been exposed to different childhood events or whatever, and we could see how they respond later on in life. Every single human being is incredibly different from every single other human being, and so when you then want to say, well, is stress the thing that's making people, is it making them unwell? It's you can never really answer that because you've got such a heterogeneous, such a different population that you're looking at all of the time. All I can say is that the evidence is that chronic stress contributes to the susceptibility you have of getting cardiovascular disease, getting depressed, and things like this. Yes, it is a contributing factor, but it is not the single cause.
Let's just touch on, are we more stressed than we used to be? You hear this a lot. We're more stressed now than we were. What's your take on that?
Well, anyone who has relatives who are old enough to have been through the Great Depression will tell you that it's absolute rubbish. I mean, in the past, if you were working in a factory and you had an accident, you would get sacked because you might have damaged your arm and you can't do the job. You would then have no salary. Your family would be starving. I mean, we are actually in a society which is a very privileged society. Uh, there are different stresses that we're under, but what is happening now is that it has become uh, people like to consider or think about stress. It's something people are much more frequently complain about, and they tend to think about. Whereas in the past, we didn't. People like that didn't think that they were stressed. They just knew those ghastly things were happening to them, and they didn't know how to get out of it, and they had no power to get out of it. Uh, Nowadays, it's a different level of stress. So I don't think we're more stressed. It's just modern society stresses are different.
Just thinking of it biologically, the just looking at the acute stress, so that see a lion, that adaptive, positive, beneficial, life-saving reaction, and chronic stress, are they one and the same mechanism? You keep hearing that, oh, well, it's just your fight or flight that's in a chronic state. Or is it a little bit more, is there more to it than that?
There's much more to it than that, and the evidence that you are having a flight type of response when you're undergoing some chronic stressors is just not there. The scientific evidence behind that is extremely weak. It's different, and a lot of it is perception, and a lot of it is psychological, and trying to work out exactly the mechanisms involved is incredibly, incredibly difficult. I mean, if you put people under severe chronic stress, yes, then you will find hormonal abnormalities. But then we're talking about really severe stress. We're not talking about everyday life stress. And so the evidence that everyday life stress does activates these same flight responses just isn't there.
Let's think about, well, what are the practicalities of this? I'm curious whether it's something that's worth at least factoring into your health and wellness plans. Yeah, do you know what? If I could minimize some of my stress, I suspect that will probably be advantageous for me. Do you think, is that fair, or is there even any science out there that would support that? Or what's your thoughts?
Well, there's certainly some science out there. I think what the science out there does tell us is that if you uh, live a life in which you have very little control of your environment, then that really is bad for you. And so there was a lovely study done in Whitehall, which was comparing lots of different people in Whitehall, from the mandarins who are running Whitehall to uh, the most lowly, least paid people in Whitehall. And the really surprising aspect of this, in many ways, although in retrospect, not surprising, was the people who were showing the most stress responses were some of the most junior people. And these were the people who were being given jobs to do, but couldn't do them and had no control over it. Because the people on top, if they were given instructions, you do this, that, and the other, they would then call the next tier down and say, you've got to do this, that, and the other. So they just pass it on to the next group, and they can then pass it down. It's the people who have a whole lot of problems in life which they have no control over, they can't do anything about. If you have a really big problem, uh, and there's a way of solving it, actually, that can be quite restful. That can be actually quite a nice thing to do because you are then working out a way of how you actually solve that problem. So, in a roundabout way, answering your question is if you look at your life and you look at the things that you have control over and you don't have control over, and you try and aim your life down a route in which you are doing the things which you can control, then you will be in a much better situation.
So, can the other life pillars be stressors like chronically poor sleep, like maybe a poor diet? Do those types of chronic stressors, which maybe don't make us feel emotionally under stress, but can they be again? Is there a reason to just be thoughtful of those as well?
Well, absolutely. I think when I talk about perception of stress, there's conscious perception of stress of when we see what's happening around us. But of course, you have internal stresses. So there are things that are going on in your body when you're ill, which will activate your immune system and other things that will cause stress. So there are conscious and unconscious forms of stress. But with respect to what you were saying, I think probably the best example is sleep. And sleep is an extraordinarily important part of our lives. The time of lots of regeneration. It's the times when our brains are sorting out all the memories of all the things that have happened the day before. It's a critically important time. Also, it's a time which fixes your body clock. So you have a clock in your head. And I'm sure many of the listeners will be aware that often when they put your alarm, you put your alarm clock on, you wake up about a minute before the alarm clock goes off. And that's because you've actually got a clock in your head, which is incredibly accurate and knows exactly what the time of day is. And this clock is very important to set your body because the needs of your body when you wake up in the morning are very different from the needs of your body when you're fast asleep at about 2 in the morning. And so you need your metabolism, your cardiovascular system, so your heart rate and your blood pressure, your immune system, they all vary over the 24 hours. And it's all closely tied up. This 24-hour rhythm is closely tied up for all the tissues in the body. And if you have a nice 7 or 8 hours of sleep regularly, everything within your body clock and in terms of the rhythms of your bodies are really well set. But you deviate from that, and what happens is that your body clock is doing one thing and your body is doing something else. And that is extremely unhealthy. And there's been a lot of interest in this. And what's really interested me is that it's not the length of time you sleep. I mean, if you sleep too little, obviously that's bad. But what's most important is the regularity of it, the time you go to bed and the time you wake up in the morning. And there is now good evidence that people who have irregular times of going to bed and getting up in the morning. That you might like to call it a stressor, but let's say it makes you much more susceptible to getting a lot of different diseases. And so we always knew people on shift work uh, die early of all sorts of different conditions, everything from cancer to heart attacks. If you have disturbed sleep, it is extremely bad for you. But we now begin to understand that it can be even more subtle than this. That just disorders in the time you go to sleep and getting up again is enough to disrupt your body. So the answer to your question is yes.
I don't know that that's still yet fully appreciated because there doesn't seem to be any balance to how shift workers let's say used in the system. Do you think there should be, like, do you think people who have to work shift work, there nearly needs to be that stress needs to be offset in some way. I don't know what you can do, but do you have any thoughts on them?
Well, I think the really most important thing about shift work is that if you're going to work night shifts and day shifts, you should do prolonged numbers of night shifts and day shifts. Just doing night shifts is fine. If you're on 6 months of night shifts, that health-wise isn't a problem. You'll reset your body clock. You can reset it by about 1 hour a day. You'll reset it to that time, and you'll continue that for that 6 months, and then you change again. That's fine. That's not going to be a problem. But what the people who run companies need to be aware of is that they shouldn't be changing people's shifts regularly. So, well, one day you might be working from 9 to 5, the next from uh, 10 to 12. You shouldn't be keep changing it, because that's what's dangerous. And so the people who are running our 24-hour society or running companies which are working for over 24 hours need to be aware of how they can change the pattern of work of their staff in a way that is least detrimental to their health. And that science is known now.
Yeah, so there's no excuse. And
No.
and I would say I'll be a little bit controversial, and I would say that's particularly important for nurses. Now, this is just my experience, but as a doctor in A&E, the nurses swing more from day to night. Like they'll literally come off a day shift and they'll be on a night shift the next night. This type of pattern. Doctors seem to be a little bit more in clusters of shifts,
No.
but the nurses can be very irregular. Any of the other life pillars like exercise, can there be such thing as too much exercise? Is that too controversial?
Um, well, yes. I mean, there studies have been done on U.S. Marines doing extraordinary levels of, I wouldn't call it exercise, but physical activity. And that, if you take that to an extreme, that is certainly bad for you. But I guess what is essentially a problem is people who get so totally hung up on exercise or something like this, that their whole life becomes centered around exercise. Often they're not doing themselves a favor. It should be part of healthy living. It is not, you can't do exercise and that makes everything else fine. It should be part of your healthy living, not the one aspect of healthy living that you're applying to. And if you do it really, really hard, then it's not good for you.
I kind of feel like a little bit more balance across all the key pillars and being conscious to minimize stressors across the pillars and add some little beneficial things across all the pillars is better than intensively dieting and exercising alone and ignoring the others. Do you think there's something in there? And
Oh, definitely.
I'll work on finding out that balance.
I will absolutely agree with that.
If someone thought they were stressed or whatever, tell me anything that's worth knowing about measurements. Is there any benefit in measuring it? Or is your gestalt, like how you feel, better than any test? Or is what's going on in the kind of testing of stress world?
It's an important question, this, because there are a lot of people who are creating what you and I would probably call the worried well, uh, by telling people that there are all sorts of tests that they should do which will measure whether or not they're stressed. And they do these tests and they're told, oh, this test shows that you're stressed, you should be changing your lifestyle. And none of these tests are valid. The one that I get really most upset about is people who say they're going to do a salivary cortisol estimation on you, and they will give you measure a level of cortisol in your saliva, and they then tell you you're either stressed or you're not stressed. I mean, you can't do it. It's completely meaningless. At any individual point of time during the day, if you look at 1,000 normal people, well functioning normal people, the variation in their levels of cortisol at that one point in time will be massive. Everything from what your wellness uh, doctor will tell you is highly stressed to being, oh my goodness, you're so laid back, you're going to fall over. These Your cortisol levels go up and down in normal people very fast over the period over the day. And when you wake up in the morning, most people go up a bit and then come down, but some people start going down and then go up. It's this would I'm talking about normal people here, and the fact that somebody can tell you they can take a salivary cortisol from you and tell you whether you're stressed or not, that is just totally untrue. It is not based on any science at all. It is based on the fact that this particular individual feels that maybe he can get people to come to his clinic because he's got this test that will tell them whether or not they're stressed.
So how do people know? Is it just like it's an internal thing? You know yourself if if you feel it, or
As I said to you, I find that I can't define stress at all. So if you're unable to define stress, you certainly can't measure it. And so there's no simple measure. So if you believe in the term stress, the only way that you could do that is by what you're feeling. But as I say, I don't know what the word stress means. I know what stressors are, but I don't know what stress means. I can't measure it, but I do know that I'm feeling stressed as if something stresses them. I can feel stressed. Yes. And this might be a symptom of anxiety. It might be there are multiple things that might be going on, but it's really a psychological construct rather than anything else. And so it is what is going on inside you.
okay, well that leads us in nicely to what we can do about it.
Well, the most important thing is sharing it. So males are particularly bad at this. Women are rather better at this. Being able to talk about your life, your anxieties, your pressures with somebody. I mean, it could be a therapist, it could be a friend, it could be a group of friends, group of people, but actually being able to share what is causing you to feel like this with other people is in itself a very important way to help resolve it. Keeping it all to yourself is not helpful. So I think that is probably one of the first things. And if you don't have a group of friends you can do this with, then a therapist or something that's if you can afford it, obviously, if you have access to them, can be really important in getting to understand what it is that's making you feel like that. And once, of course, you understand what it is that's causing you to feel like that, then you're in a better position to change your lifestyle in a way to diminish uh, this problem within your life. So I think that's important. Obviously, there are lots of things that are good for people. I mean, just going for long walks in the woods is incredibly useful. Uh, enjoying nature. Uh, one of the sort of things that are really important to people is having little projects that you can succeed at. I'm not talking about sort of major, huge building projects or something. It might be making some bonsai trees. It might be just improving your garden. It could be some DIY. It doesn't really matter what it is, but to have projects in your life which can be important to you and that you can achieve. And when you achieve them, you get a feeling of achievement from them. Things like this are really important. Not just mulling over what is wrong, but actually finding something you can do and something that you can enjoy doing. Things like that, to me, are really important ways forward.
Does medical intervention ever help?
First of all, you've got to uh, check that there isn't a psychiatric diagnosis. So if a patient is depressed uh, uh, or has general anxiety syndrome or something, then we're putting those to a side. We're talking about people who are stressed who don't have a psychiatric diagnosis. And in that case, no, medication is not appropriate. The brain is central to all this. The brain's perception of stress, whether it's an internal stress or an external stress, and the way it responds. Part of its response is by activating your stress systems, including your adrenaline, noradrenaline, and your cortisol systems. Activating those systems in the short term does a lot of good things. In the long term, if you're having higher levels of cortisol for long periods of time, it can cause problems. The answer to this is actually dealing with the primary area which is causing your symptoms. And the primary area causing your symptoms is in your brain, and that's behavioral. And the ways of improving that is by changing the way you run your life.
Anything you would like to say on that? I know this isn't your area of expertise, but just about resilience building, or is there any obvious research or new novel thinking or ideas or around that, or is that a bit beyond what you would like to mention?
Well, there's increasing understanding of what's actually going on in the brain during this situation where you're exposed to chronic stressors or to nasty early lifetime events. And what it appears is that your connectivity between two parts of the brain called the basolateral amygdala and the hippocampus is absolutely critical for this. And changes in the activity of this pathway will change your susceptibility to be feeling stressed. Now, I'm careful in what I'm saying here because this data is all from looking at studies in rodents rather than in humans. But similar studies that have been done in humans suggest the same sort of thing that's going on. So the bottom line is that you can get fixed into activation of certain pathways in your brain, which makes you feel chronically stressed. And you would need to change your environment and change the way you do things to change the pattern to a pattern which would create a much more normal and inverted commas happier you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think we're coming close to the end. I thought I would just ask a couple more questions if that's okay. Any comments? So I kind of feel, and again, one of the major reasons I started this journey is it feels like being healthy and well is a stressor. There's so many supplements and exercise plans and diet plans and testing kits and cortisol testing kits, and I mean, it's just this overwhelm of, well, what should I do and where do I begin and what choices do I make? And that to me feels like a little bit of a stressor in its own right. I just wondering, is that a fair assumption? Do you feel like that could potentially be, and it's probably just another part of modern life. That it probably fits in the modern life stressor bracket.
No, I think you've got a very good point. I mean, the wellness industry is an extremely well-funded industry at the moment, and basically it's funded by virtue of making people worried that they might not be well. And so there's a whole industry out there telling you that you should be eating this, eating that. You should be measuring your cortisols. You should be measuring your blood sugar all the time and checking whenever you have a meal whether your blood sugar goes up a little bit too much or too little. And these are really not founded in any good science at all. And what they do is they create what we've discussed as the worried well, people who are fit and well, but are trying all of these things, thinking it'll make them even better. But actually, what it does, it makes them worry because clearly they're going to at some point find something which seems to be abnormal. It probably won't be abnormal, but it seems to be abnormal. And somebody will tell them, we've seen that, so maybe you should do this, that, and the other. No, we're creating illness by making people so self-conscious of everything that they do that it is in itself a problem. So yes, I agree with you. Our society has gone down that sort of route.
I think we've kind of come to the end. Thank you so much. I feel like what I'm gathering is make some sensible choices across each of the pillars. Keep it fairly low, a few key choices, not overly stressful. Don't overly think about it. Life is about living in the moment. Enjoy your life, get on with it. But maybe do a few key things if you're wanting to kind of maximize your chances of a healthy older age. Do you think there's something in that? And I know that's very broad, but
Well, I'm sure it is. I mean, it's having a good balance in your life and also having good support around you. And the combination of both of those is really what gives you good mental health.
Professor Lightman, this has been hugely enlightening. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. It's been great fun.